I'm Yasmin Gagne.
I'm Josh Christensen.
And this is Most Innovative Companies, Video Edition. So, Josh, what is the most rich person aspect of your life?
Very little is a rich person aspect of my life. I mean, the most rich person aspect of my life is...
You have a car in New York City.
I do have a car in New York City, but I was going to say...
You live in a building with a dog run.
Okay, maybe I do have a dog run in my building, but it's not... I don't know. It's still like a 600 square foot apartment. It's not like this crazy nice thing. I was going to say my penchant for a tasting menu. I don't go out to fancy dinners all the time, but I love a tasting menu. So when I can splurge... You're more of a rustic sort of...
Yeah, I'm just like, give me a big plate of something good.
Well, your favorite restaurant's Cafe Mogador, which is like a very rustic Moroccan place, which I went to, by the way. Did I tell you that I went to Cafe Mogador? It's so good. What did you think? It's so really good. I got the lamb shank.
The portions are big and the food is good.
Yeah. Oh, no, I love that too. But like one of my favorite restaurants in the city is Red Paperclip on Christopher Street, which is like a
you've
Taiwanese
talked about this.
Place. So good. They have this like lobster three-way course there and this cavatelli that is amazing. But I love an omakase. I love a tasting menu. I love being surprised and trying new food. So that's probably the bougiest thing I do. It's very rare that I go to like a $200 a plate tasting menu, and that's even on the tame side for New York City. But like, man, I love it. What about you? You are a very frugal person overall.
Generally, but the one thing I spend money on is I'll go to workout classes sometimes. Not all the time, but often if I'm working on a big story or if I'm stressed out, having 1 hour where you like cannot check your phone and where you like are working hard enough that you like can't think too much is so valuable to me. Like I'm not even paying for the workout. I'm just paying for like some time.
I get that too. And that's a very like Real Housewives of New York City type thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
If you've been to a Pilates class in New York City, you know.
Dude, Pilates classes are too expensive for me. That is one thing. I'm like, they're like $60.
That's crazy.
I'm like, I can do a bunch of crunches at home, guys.
Well, we're talking about this because we're talking about rich people today.
In his new book, The Haves and the Have-Yachts, New Yorker writer Evan Osnos journeys into the world of the super rich, where Flo Rida performs at kids' bar mitzvahs, and yachts get more and more outrageous features like pop-up disappearing restaurants. His collection of essays takes a look at the new Gilded Age we're in and what that widening inequality means for American society.
This is an extended cut of this interview that you can only see on Fast Company's YouTube page. But we have a bunch of other content in the audio version of MIC that you can hear on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or YouTube Music. So be sure to subscribe to Fast Company right here on YouTube or to the Most Innovative Companies podcast wherever you listen.
And now, my interview with Evan Osnos. Did you watch Mountainhead this weekend?
Oh, God. I'm like the last person who hasn't seen it. Everybody keeps saying,
because it's like so related to your book.
That's what I gather.
Okay.
And I mean, it's almost to the point where I'm going to have to start faking it and being like, boy, that ending. Wow. But look, I was very influenced by Succession and what Jesse Armstrong was doing there. And I think it's just in the air, this feeling that we all need to know more about what's going on in the heads of people in power like that.
So I read these articles in the New Yorker as they came out. Did you always know they were going to be a collection? Did you decide you were going to start writing a series on the ultra rich? Like, how did this come about?
You know, sometimes, as in this case, I started writing a few pieces with an idea in mind that I wanted to understand something. Mm-hmm. And then it became like kind of a calling, to use a really overly dramatic description. But I'll be honest, I mean, 2016, when Donald Trump was elected president, I realized that the normal tools of political analysis, the way that I usually write about what's happening in the world, were not going to suffice. Like, I couldn't understand how a guy who declared himself the enemy of the elites and voters would subscribe to that idea could somehow inhabit that role while being the billionaire son of a real estate family in New York. And I needed to understand. And the answer to that lay ultimately in trying to understand the mechanics of the big money world. And that was the origins of this. And
I'm going to get to that right after this. But how did you persuade your editor to write an article on yachts? Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a truly very cushy assignment.
I will say I have not received hardship pay for that one. Try as I might. I had the miraculous good fortune that the editor suggested that piece. I'd been writing some of these pieces in this vein, and he said, "How about yachts?" I said, "Say no more. I'll be back in 6 months. I can be reached at various European addresses." I mean, the truth was, it was like, this sounds ridiculous because I've worked in hard places, but it's kind of a hard story to do because people don't particularly want to talk about it. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of where the challenge lies.
So to go back to the, actual point you were making before, you begin the book by talking about how ubiquitous the ultra wealthy are in the administration. You mentioned that inequality has led to the undoing of many societies. You can go into, now's your history time. Do you think America is there? Like, how do you think about that?
I think we are at a very tenuous moment, and I don't think I'm unique in that impression. I think all of us, no matter where we sit on the political spectrum, and that's a telling fact, that we all look at it and say, this feels really fragile and it feels volatile. And the question, of course, is why? And many people will have multiple explanations, but from my perspective, you can't understand this period in any sensible way without recognizing that we're living at a time of really historic, arguably unprecedented inequality in this country. That's not an abstraction. I mean, we are right now, the richest people in America have a larger share of the nation's wealth than their predecessors did in the Gilded Age, the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies and the Rockefellers. And so if you want to really have an honest conversation about what will it take to hold this country together, and let's remind ourselves, we've been through these moments before and we've found our way back to a more stable, productive, democratic future, then we have to be honest about the facts.
You also talk a little bit about how, the ultra wealthy in previous times maybe felt some more need for like civic engagement. That doesn't really seem to be the case now. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's a fascinating time because, there was a time where the Andrew Carnegies of the world felt like, maybe it was their religious reasons, but that they needed to put something back for the country that had helped them prosper. And there was a time not so long ago, in fact, when a generation of philanthropists, you guys have covered it on the show, they really did believe, like the Bill Gates and the Warren Buffetts, that you would make the country stronger, you'd make capitalism stronger, you'd make your own businesses stronger by having a robust philanthropic commitment and doing it very visibly and publicly. Yeah. This generation right now, we'll call them the sort of post-Gates, post-Buffett tycoons are they have different views on this matter. As Elon Musk has said explicitly, he believes his greatest gift, in a sense, to humanity, I'm paraphrasing here, but not much, is Tesla. Because as he says, look, that is going to be a great contribution to mitigating the effects of climate change. Other people would say it doesn't have to be either or. You could do yes and a person with your resources, if you did it, it would have a signal effect. And I think so much of what we're talking about today is about symbols and signaling. It's about what are the messages that some of the most influential, successful people in our culture are sending to others. They're sending messages all the time about what they care about, what priorities matter, and what does it take to have a thriving, inclusive, growing economy and society.
Now, the back third of the book maybe is dedicated to grifters, essentially.
Yeah.
Which are
alleged in some cases.
Alleged grifters, the Getty money manager. Unclear if she's a grifter or not. It's an ongoing lawsuit.
In her case, I don't think so. I think she is. Look, in any lawsuit, there are flying accusations in both cases, in both ways. But she's actually in the second section of the book. So
I apologize.
Yeah, no, that's okay. But there are more than enough grifters in the back section.
That you had, the fake Hollywood producer who ran a insane Ponzi scheme.
Exactly.
Tell me about why they fascinated you, and also what they say about the kind of Second Gilded Age we're living in.
I got fascinated by grifters. I mean, we are, I think, as a country, historically have been. I mean, going all the way back to Ben Franklin was in his own way. I mean, as such a fantastic demonstration of self-actualization, and he created the whole genre of kind of self-help, really, and was a model for so much of what we admire. And he was also the first guy who practiced a little bit of fake it till you make it, and was essentially he crystallized this very American idea of we are a nation of people on the move, both physically, geographically, because we're a nation of immigrants, and we are also a country in which people can get up on one coast, move themselves to the other coast, and start all over again.
Yep.
So we have baked into us like the potential for fantastic grift. And I gravitated to a couple of cases, one in particular of a guy who had kind of slipped beneath the radar at the time. He's gotten some more attention, but it's a pretty amazing case of a guy who named Zach Horowitz, who decided he wanted to be an actor and wanted to be a filmmaker.
It is funny how throughout the piece you have people saying he was a terrible actor. You know, like,
it was a very persistent theme in the reporting. People kept saying, you know, they felt compelled to add, they're like, he really is just perhaps the worst actor I've ever worked with. And I thought that was so interesting because it didn't impede his career.
Yeah.
I mean, it kept going. And the reason, and I won't give it all away because it's kind of a fun story, but he found this unholy union between film financing and getting on screen. But as a result, by raising these vast sums of money, he was tapping into something really powerful, which is that there are people around the country who, for whatever reason, say, you know, it might be fun to finance a movie and, you know, maybe someday I'll end up clinking glasses with Tom Hanks or whoever it is. And I always mention, I think of him in my mind in this analogy just because I'm like, if I was a dentist in Omaha, who would I want to clink glasses with? It's probably Tom Hanks. And Zach Horowitz, who really, you know, one director who worked with him described the experience as like trying to elicit a performance from a cardboard box. But yet he managed to get on screen with like Olivia Munn and Ralph Fiennes and Brian Cox from Succession. And that, for me, is about a story of how does fake it till you make it become like an anthem in this country, and why does it seem to permeate so much of what we see and do?
And it's also funny because he was a bad actor, but all of his investors claim he was remarkably convincing, you know, walking them through fake documents, right?
Completely right. I mean, you nailed it. That's the most interesting thing, was that he was a struggling performer on screen, but was an absolutely Academy Award-winning grifter in his personal finances with others. And,
you know, speaking of grift, I go back to the yacht essay, which is probably my favorite in the book, because it's a world that I really knew nothing about. And you talk about all the weird loopholes people have, you know, the fact that if you get sued in a country where your yacht is parked, I suppose the country has to like maintain it at a cost of thousands of dollars a day. But you also mentioned, for instance, a lot of crypto billionaires are buying yachts. How do you see yachts as part of like a grift or as part of like a way to hide money or transfer it?
Well, you hit on something fascinating, which is that it's like the yachts are a symbol of a world in which capital is more mobile and more fluid, and in which borders are kind of liquefied. I mean, and I had this really interesting interview with a guy who has been in this world, in the yachting world, for decades. And he started off when he was like a sailing instructor in this little village in Monaco and kind of watched it turn into this ginormous industry with huge amounts of money on the line. And he said every decade or two, there is like a new industry. First, it was the Greek shipping fortunes. Then it was, and so you saw Aristotle Onasis.
I still think about your description of having a pool with mosaic tiles on the bottom that rises up to become a dance floor.
If you're looking
very
for
cool.
Something to do at home, it's an option. And you know, one of the things that's so fascinating is like there's always rivalries and status anxieties.
Yeah.
And he was like competing against another shipping magnate who had a slightly larger yacht. And that guy one-upped the rising dance floor by coming up with a gyroscope that would keep his yacht from getting too rocky on the high seas. So it was kind of like, you know, shall we say, a little bit of comparison between the two. They were constantly competing.
Well, I thought about it also because it was Stavros Niarchos, right?
Yes, exactly.
And his son or grandson is now married to, I'm going to get this wrong, Roman Abramovich's ex-wife, I believe.
If
it's
so,
like such a
that is the whole yachting world, by the way. And there is and this is another reason of why I chose these symbols to write about. And let's be honest, the reason I'm writing about yachts is not because I have particularly deep fascination with tying knots. It's because I actually am trying to depict and understand the symbolism of money in our time. And these have become, I think, the super yacht is like the super symbol of our era. And that's not an abstraction. That's a literal fact. I mean, there used to be 10 of the largest yachts about a generation ago, and now there are 170. And they occupy this kind of strange place in our culture. They're both visible and invisible. I mean, you see them in the New York Post or in the Daily Mail, but they're designed partly to stay out of reach. But they are the most conspicuous machines that anybody could possibly own.
And they're so funny because they depreciate in value immediately. You know what I mean? It's like such a money pit.
Yeah, the FT, I remember the Financial Times wrote a great piece that described them as about as financially prudent as buying 10 Van Goghs and then holding them above your head while you're treading water. And it is true. I mean, some of the yacht brokers who I talked to and the manufacturers who I reported on, they would say to me, look, this is not a particularly prudent investment. This is essentially something for people who have limitless resources.
Yeah. But I apologize. I interrupted you were talking about the sort of history of yacht.
Oh, I was yeah, that's right. Well, there was a transition from the shipping generation, then it was the oil money. And so all of a sudden it was people from Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and they had different needs, they were sailing their yachts around the Arabian Peninsula. And so, they were inside all the time. They needed good air conditioning. But what's really interesting about it is it really tells you something about the global economy. Where is the center of gravity at any moment in our time? And after, of course, the first generation of oil money, that's when you started to get the IT fortunes. And then ultimately the new generation are the crypto yachts. And so you could chart in its own way the history of American economics over the last 60 years by looking at the high seas.
You also talk a little bit about how it's almost, this is not the right way to put it, but easier for a billionaire to live on a luxurious yacht versus living on land, in the sense that it's kind of uncouth to show how rich you are on land, in a sense. Like, tell me more about that.
Yeah, it was a Silicon Valley CEO said to me, look, the honest fact is that you can't live in a $500 million house because the optics are weird. Your employees will be enraged at you. He said, but the truth is $500 million boat's pretty nice.
Yeah.
And that is a strange fact, but it is a fact. This same CEO said to me, the yacht is the best place to, as he put it, absorb excess capital. So it is also a little economic story here about a time in which a certain number of platforms, a certain number of businesses have generated so much because of the ownership structure for their founders and for key investors, that they are quite literally encountering this problem of having excess capital and having to figure out ways that you can park it in places that won't cause you blowback socially and culturally and ultimately in business terms.
Or also won't, you talked about the sale of a yacht somewhere in the Mediterranean so they wouldn't get taxed. I think that was
an
MBS.
Amazing one.
Yeah,
that was the Saudi Crown Prince, MBS. According to some documents that were leaked, his lawyers had advised him that he should acquire his what's called a giga yacht, meaning it's the largest kind of yacht. It's called Serene, and I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but it was about $500 million. But that he should formally take ownership in international waters because it would avoid taxes. Now, one question that struck me, of course, was who is the taxes would be charged by his own government, as far as I can tell. But look, I think actually, all kidding aside, that gets to something, which is that in many of these cases, the instinct that's driving it is essentially scale for scale's sake. It's the size of a boat simply for the size of it. And in this case, he's saving money on taxes that would have gone to his own royal family ultimately. And I think that's one of the themes that I noticed across this world. In a way, this is the natural result of an unthinking cult of scale. And I think that's important. It's slightly heretical to talk about. Of course, it's not that long ago that we were thinking, scale is an unambiguous good. But one of the experiences I had in reporting this book was when I wrote a profile of Mark Zuckerberg a few years ago, was sort of talking to him and to his employees about this period when essentially connecting people, growing, that was a euphemism for growing, was a self-justifying, self-fulfilling idea. It was an end in itself. And the yachts are kind of the symbolic representation of that concept.
Have you read Careless People?
I have read Careless People.
How did you reconcile it with your sort of impression of Zuck?
Well, I thought it was, obviously I can understand why the company didn't like the book, but I think it's very important for that account to be out there because we're at a time when these are no longer just CEOs and founders. These are people who have a tremendous influence over our own lives and over our children's lives based on what they can see and read and believe. And I actually found some of the humanizing details, while they're not particularly flattering, actually are helpful in helping Americans understand that when we have companies that have this much control over what we see, that they are also geopolitical actors. I mean, there is a very memorable moment when Mark Zuckerberg is said to have asked President Xi Jinping of China to name his baby, give her a Chinese name. And I worked in China a long time, and I could just see in that moment, sort of like imagine it through the eyes of Xi Jinping, and he would say, I've got them. Yeah. I've got them exactly where I want them because they'll do anything. And that in its own way is the danger of a growth mindset at all costs. Because if Facebook had done whatever it could, including allowing Xi Jinping to name the founder's daughter, if Facebook had done whatever it could to get into China, what would that have done to Facebook? What would that have done to the company's values? And ultimately, maybe it was also never going to happen in the first place.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I want to talk a little bit about your essay on Greenwich, Connecticut, which you grew up in.
Yeah, that's where I grew up.
It's the kind of essay that I love where, sorry, this is such a kiss-ass thing to say, but when you've like thought about a bunch of different things and then you read it and it's like very coherent.
That's what the New Yorker is supposed to do. Yeah. We will take random ideas that have been percolating and try to put them into some logical conversation with one another.
When did you decide to write it? Why did you decide to write it?
I grew up in this town right outside New York City. It's always been a prosperous place. It was kind of an amazing place to grow up as a kid. It's the only public high school that I know of that has an electron microscope.
Yeah, that was wild.
Yeah, and there was also a point at which I became aware of the fact that Greenwich told us something really important about something that was happening in Republican politics. Greenwich had been traditionally like the birthplace of the country club Republican.
Yeah, you mentioned the Bushes.
The Bush family was from there. Prescott Bush, who was the father of George H.W. Bush. I mean, he was quite literally the country club golf champion in town. And he was the senator from Connecticut. And he was an old school moderate Republican, what they used to call a Rockefeller Republican. He was actually Ike's, golf partner in Washington. But in 2016, the Republican town committee in Greenwich was led by somebody who came out and said, I'm not going to vote for Jeb Bush. I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. Yeah. And that became kind of a revealing indicator because in communities and in Republican strongholds that we might have thought of being more inclined towards a John Kasich or a sort of moderate Republicanism, they were lining up with Trump. And that, for me, meant, okay, there's something really important to understand here. And part of the explanation, and this sort of gets to throughout the book, is that there had been a decision along the way, or almost a non-decision, to say we can no longer afford to do the kind of moderate Republican thing that maybe gives a little here and takes a little here, but ultimately believes in working with Democrats. That it had become a more, and look, there's an argument to be made that there was a similar thing going on the Democratic side in terms of getting more and more extreme. But it was when you had the birthplace of country club republicanism begin to line up with Donald Trump, I said, I've got to understand how that happened. And this essay tells that story.
How do you think, as you were reporting, what did you learn about the way American elites paved the way for Trump's election?
Yeah, I thought a lot about this. I mean, the idea of people in the 1980s and 90s, there was a time when, remember, Donald Trump, as I grew up around New York City, and he was a kind of permanent piece of the media furniture. He was just he was in the papers all the time, partly because he was pretending to be his own publicist and planting stories. But, that was just like a part of the landscape. And then to see him become something else in the eyes of Americans more broadly through The Apprentice was like a turning point where all of a sudden he went from being known as a kind of, people here knew him as a marginal business story. He sometimes succeeded. He had a lot of bankruptcies. But through the power of this invented persona, he became the icon of a big city successful capitalist. And look, I think that there is a lot of blame to go around a lot of places for, in a sense, kind of creating the myth of Donald Trump that continued for so long. Part of the reason why, I think why the word elite has become so fraught is that Trump used his own position in communities of power to say to the American public, look, because I am an elite, I can help you pick the lock. I will help you understand why it's corrupt, how it works. And therefore I, dear voter, will give you a piece of the action. That's been his enduring promise. And I will tell you that, after a half a century of him selling the illusion of access to power and fortune, he and his family have actually now realized in 2025 that the thing people will pay most exorbitantly for is access to the highest reaches of the United States government. And his son, Don Jr., has created a club called Executive Branch with an initiation fee of up to $500,000, as you probably heard. And you're going to need to start saving now. But it will, if you want, get you quite literally what it sounds like, which is access to the executive branch.
And it's funny because you also talk about the fact that the people he hired ultimately into his cabinet are elites. I mean, the amount of them who, graduated from Harvard, I think you have as examples. Yeah,
and he named 13 billionaires to the highest ranks of his administration. And I want to say something, which is, look, there is nothing inherently wrong with that. You can imagine a scenario in which you say, look, these are people who have succeeded. They understand the market. They understand economics. What becomes a problem is when the administration is so secluded from the experience of regular life that it has a very hard time expressing and enacting the public will. I mean, it was quite telling when Howard Lutnick, Secretary of Commerce, of course, said that his mother-in-law wouldn't notice if her Social Security check didn't show up. I think there's a lot of Americans that probably would notice if their Social Security check didn't show up. I think this is part of what Elon Musk ran into, is that when he started talking about empathy as a weakness of Western civilization or Social Security as a Ponzi scheme, it was a little bit of a revealing indicator of how much his life had become divorced, really, from the experience of ordinary people.
That makes a lot of sense. You talk a lot, and you sort of touched on this earlier about elites sort of deriding other elites and saying, but I'm different because I understand the common man. Why do you think that is so resonant with voters?
It's a fascinating question. I mean, I've noticed that Americans hate the noun, the elite, but we love the adjective elite. So elite Navy SEALs, yes, please. But the Georgetown elite, no thank you. And part of what's happening there is that as the country has become more clearly divided between people who have access to opportunity and power and privilege and everybody else, and this, I'm not making an abstract statement, we know that in the data, that the gap is just literally larger, that people inevitably begin to say, well, what does it take? What do they know? How can I get a piece of that? How do I get behind that velvet rope?
I actually remember we were talking about this. Actually, it was over on the Inc. side, which is, I don't work for Inc., but they were saying, their readers can't get enough of reading about Jeff Bezos because they believe on some level, like, I will be able to. I don't hate him because one day I could be him.
Yeah, that's a hugely important point, Yaz. I actually think that's like a central nerve in this book, too, is that Americans at their core want to get rich.
Yeah.
We always have and we always will. That is baked into the American idea. And what's happening now is that people in larger and larger numbers are beginning to realize that there are these impediments to that process. Donald Trump's appeal, part of the reason why he was able to win again, was that he is able to say to people, even in an unspoken way, sometimes it's explicit, but exactly as you described, people say, look, I think he wants me to prosper. He wants me to succeed. And I think part of the process of getting people to understand or getting people to visualize some of the fault lines in our economy that are, in fact, making it harder for people to prosper is about not getting people. The key is not saying to people, you should give up on the goal of getting rich. The key is on giving people the information and the tools to understand why they're not.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, as you reported these stories, and I think about Greenwich, I think about the yacht article. How difficult was it to get people to talk? How many people did you talk to off the record to write these essays, or like on background to write
There's a lot of that. There's a lot of that. And there's something scandalous about complaining about the difficulty of reporting when you're talking about, doing it in Palm Beach. But anybody who's done this kind of reporting knows it's complicated. And it takes time, and you linger and you ask a lot of questions. And I think part of the reason why we don't have a lot of books of this kind is because it takes a process of essentially slow motion immersion. And I think that, there was a piece in me that, having come up in foreign correspondence and writing about the rest of the world, writing about politics in Washington, there were times where I was like, why am I really writing about this? And I knew exactly why, which is that this is fundamentally as much a story of our sociology and the basic substructure of our culture as Americans in the year 2025 as any of the sort of policy questions or the geopolitical questions.
Yeah.
And for me, it felt a little bit like being a foreign correspondent sometimes, actually.
Well, I also felt like, I think about an anecdote you have of, I think, eating breakfast on, I'm going to get yacht terminology wrong, the terrace of a yacht, and seeing a man looking up at you, clearly jealous. And I was like, oh, what's also an advantage? You grew up in Greenwich. You can fit in on a boat to some extent.
Very aware.
You know what I mean?
It is totally right. I remember that moment was a memorable one where I was, I'd kind of gotten into this world for a while, and there I was. And the reason why it was so notable to me was I'm sitting there on the terrace at this yacht club in Monaco, and this guy, and I'm looking at him, and I began, for the very first moment, it was just a fleeting sensation. It came and it went, but it left a very durable impression, which was I felt this little pang of superiority. And I could instantly understand this culture, why it is that somebody who has just spent $100 million on a machine would suddenly say, I've got to spend $120 million, and I've got to ultimately keep going and keep going. There's this kind of arms race. But I was, there was a way in which I was, I think I'm kind of ambidextrous in trying to understand a world that I didn't really come from, but I could approximate, and it was like learning any other language. Yeah,
that makes a lot of. What is the secret to seeming wealthy? Have you figured it out? What is like the best status symbol you saw? That's because I feel like
relaxation. You have to be casual in all things. See, right there, your insistence on getting your sentence right, you wouldn't do that if you'd been born with a tremendous
incorrect grammar all the
you
time.
would have just been content to let the words tumble forth in whatever arrangement they fell. I think, there's a great line in when you're coming up as a young reporter. I remember somebody told me, I worked on the Metro desk at the Chicago Tribune, and I had a crusty older reporter say, if you need to get past any tape or barrier or whatever, just walk with purpose and preferably carry a clipboard, because nobody ever stops somebody with a clipboard. And the yachting equivalent of that is if you just look unbelievably relaxed, like you could almost drift off to sleep with your comfort in this place, nobody will question it.
Because, right, there are salespeople who spot the real ones from the fake ones.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, that was a fascinating little discovery, was that the people who are in charge of selling yachts have become quite proficient in the little indicators. They can look at you and figure out based on your shoes or your wristwatch or your
that's what I'm saying.
T-shirt, whether you belong in, there's a wonderful term for the category of others, which is ineligible visitors. And they will just gently steer you to the ranks of the ineligible visitors. And at one point in the Palm Beach Yacht Club, at the Palm Beach Yacht Show, they were using binoculars to examine the crowd and figure out if people were a good fit.
Yeah, they're like wealth snipers.
Yeah, and there was like some really, I love the little details. Like one of them was if your business card had too much information on
stuff on it.
I mean, frankly, carrying a business card was already a tell that you probably didn't belong.
Wasn't it also in the Mark Zuckerberg essay, he had a I'm a CEO bitch card and then a regular business card?
He did, yeah. And that was, those were in his early days. I'm pretty confident he doesn't carry a business card anymore. And he bought a yacht. I mean, at a certain point.
Oh, did he?
There's a telling detail. He bought one after there was a Russian oligarch who had commissioned a yacht and then ultimately, because of sanctions and rules in Europe, was unable to take possession. And so it became available at the bargain basement price. And so Mark Zuckerberg was able to pick it up. Did you play any board games with him? I have not, but I have heard some pretty fascinating stories. I asked him about it when I was in his house at one point, and
because you described them playing, was it Risk or something like that?
He played a lot of Risk, and as somebody who played with him put it to me, they said, when Mark is playing you, he's not just playing you in a game, he's playing you in the game of games. He's trying to figure out how your head works so that how you anticipate.
Yeah.
In a sense, he's kind of, it's like training the AI. He's kind of like seeing how you respond in various scenarios so that he can ultimately anticipate your reactions before you even take them.
So that was striking to me because then in Careless People, they all talk about losing on purpose to him in Settlers of Catan.
Which is such an important detail because in a way, I think, and I ran into this a few times in his world, that he's surrounded by people who have professional and ultimately personal reasons to want him to feel confident and successful. But it can cause you problems, as we all know. And this applies well beyond politics and business. I think any of us are aware of the reality that when a leader suddenly becomes swaddled in agreement, that's when trouble happens. In his case, there was a moment when he was traveling the country, meeting regular people as an effort to try to help his image. And one of the people who had worked with him said later, look, this didn't look good. I mean, people were making fun of it online because it had a certain interplanetary quality about
sort of a J.D. Vance quality of
and the donut shop.
Exactly.
Like I enjoy your donuts. Bring these donuts.
I'll take whatever makes sense.
Yes, I'll take whatever. That's showing conviction in his donut choices. But in the case in Zuckerberg's case, nobody, as this person said, nobody would or could tell him that it didn't look right and that he should stop and reimagine it. And that's a lesson, I think, for leaders in a lot of contexts, that if you're getting way too much enthusiasm from your Politburo, then you probably have a problem.
This is something I have been thinking about a lot, and I thought about a lot when I read your book, which is when you're talking about elites who have yachts, are they completely divorced from understanding the common person? Do you think they do and they want to kind of take advantage of it? You know what I mean? Like, how big is that gulf?
I think that the experience of entering into that world is actually farther away from regular life than outsiders imagine. I mean, just as a practical fact, actually a yacht owner said to me at one point, look, I think this is the last truly luxurious lifestyle. As he said, this is the last place you can get away with it. And there was another yacht owner who said on a documentary, he said, I think if the public ever knew what it's really like on these yachts, that they'd bring back the guillotine. Yeah. And it sounds like a joke, except that part of what's happening is that they are aware. And actually that one of these owners said to me, he's like, if you don't have some guilt about it, then you're not really self-aware. And I think that there is this feeling that it is a world of service and luxury that is really so far apart from a world in which, let's be frank, people struggle every day to get healthcare, to get education, to pay their rent. And there is a way in which it becomes harder and harder for a political commons, like a political society, which is, after all, what a country is, to have these two things within the perimeter. And there was a really prophetic comment like a century ago from Louis Brandeis, who went on to join the Supreme Court. And he said, you can either have democracy or you can have money concentrated in the hands of a small number of people, but you can't have both. Mm-hmm. And I think that was one of the observations that led to the New Deal and to an effort to try to shift the balance from a concentration of resources into the hands of too few into a more equitable distribution, which did lead for decades to what was, ultimately a period of rising standards of living for more people. And that period came to an end in the late 1970s, early 80s. And I think there is a recognition on the part of some in politics that we need to figure out a way to get back to that.
Mm-hmm. I want to do a speed round here. Favorite essay to write?
It was actually the one about pop stars doing private gigs.
You know what? I knew I'd forgotten to ask you about one, and that was it.
Well, I have to say,
Flo Rida comes off very well in that piece.
He really should, and he deserves it. I embedded with Flo Rida for a bar mitzvah and some other things, but it was an experience that you do say to yourself as you're doing it, I think I will be able to die happy having done this.
What was the best? Did you attend a lot of private performances, or did you mostly hear about them?
I can't talk about the reporting, Yaz. This is a privileged fact. No, the fact is I was able to go. I was able to go.
You were on stage with Flo Rida at a child's bar mitzvah.
I wasn't on, well, let's just say I wasn't on stage, but I was able to attend these events in his entourage. And it was like being dropped through a trap door into a world that people hear about. You'll read about, I just saw that Mick Jagger played a birthday party.
When I was a kid, I used to watch My Super Sweet 16, and that was always the biggest element of that and the car reveal. But
the reason I got interested in that was like, well, what are the economics of that? I mean, what makes a pop star who could be performing in front of 40,000 screaming fans say, actually, I'm going to go to a Sweet 16 in Teaneck. And
it's streaming, right?
And also, let's be honest, in the end, it's not that complicated what motivates them to go. But the reason why this is an artifact of our time, why it's like a new thing. There was a drummer who I interviewed who does a lot of privates, and he said to me, the simple fact was, until recently, people couldn't afford to have the Foo Fighters in their backyard on a Thursday. Yeah. And now they can. And so that's like, it's one of these, I sometimes feel like I'm like a historian writing in real time about a world that we need to describe while it exists.
Although my father was a diplomat for a long time and then was a lawyer at Microsoft. And I always think about the fact that I believe they had Sheryl Crow play one year at their big employee gathering. Yeah. They had Pink. Mm-hmm. And then when the financial crisis hit, they had a U2 cover band.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
So funny.
Yeah, that sounds exactly right. I think, there are, there are times that you can tell when a company is doing well because they've got these big name acts. But it's also gotten to the point where it's a little bit of smoke and mirrors, that sometimes a company that's really on the ropes will hire a really big name because people will say, well, I mean, I guess.
we need to look like we're...
Yeah. And then the next year, they've got somebody else. That's a bad sign.
Well, the other thing you addressed Beyonce performing at that hotel in Dubai in your piece, but I always think about when her and Jay-Z performed at an Uber thing in exchange for stock. It was like one of the most lucrative deals. I mean,
that's called good management.
Yeah.
And they were probably doing it themselves, but it is just really good planning. But I think, look, if you step back and you say to yourself, what's fascinating about that is that right there is a transaction between billionaire and billionaire.
Yep.
And it is a reason why the curve, when you get to a certain point, this is probably like the takeaway on the whole book, which is that when you can kind of get on board a certain kind of opportunity and experience, then the curve goes vertical and you get access to all kinds of other things. And that can be both really satisfying for people in that position. It can be quite dangerous for a country because it means that those people are then getting further and further from the experience of everybody else. And frankly, I think it's perilous for those individuals because they run the risk of suddenly encountering a kind of backlash, realizing, they've lost touch with the people they were supposed to be in touch with.
It's sort of the ability to be in the room that others can't. I remember interviewing is a really famous movie director, whose name I can't say, and off the record, he was like, I was like, I don't know. I didn't say this to him, but I was like, your movies have been failures up until, you had a bad period and you're self-financing. And he was like, oh, well, I was part of the friends and family round at Facebook, because he knew someone, right?
Yeah.
And I always think about that. It's like there's a certain stratum that you get to. It's probably not a correct use of the word.
I think it sounds right. And it's exactly right.
Billions beget billions.
That's 100% right. And, interestingly, Warren Buffett is very candid about this. He's, in a lot of ways, I think we could do better as a culture by listening more to Warren Buffett and less to Elon Musk.
And we listen to Warren Buffett a lot. But we just don't act on it.
Well, he is the one who makes the point that at a certain point, the arithmetic momentum of a giant fortune allows it to keep growing unless you really go out of your way to screw it up. And so he's part of the chorus of people who say we need to do a better job of then figuring out how to drive that fortune out into society so that it gets into the hands of people who have more utility for it.
Yeah, get people to pay taxes, which is part of the Getty essay, right?
Exactly. That was a really interesting, kind of an amazing world to dip into in that piece because one of the essays in this book, as you say, is about, in a sense, the tax secrets that allow a big fortune to go unmolested by estate taxes and other taxes along the way. And I think that part of what Buffett has been saying over the years, which he says repeatedly, is it makes no sense for Warren Buffett, to pay less and my effective tax rate is lower than my secretary's. He says, how does that make sense? And the country has had these moments of listening to him and then forgetting about it and kind of moving on. But he is talking about the heart of the matter. It is very hard historically to find examples of countries that succeed if they get into this dynamic. I mean, not to be gloomy. I mean, we'll get into a happier note, but it's worth remembering, and I quoted in the book that the great scholar of Rome, Ramsay MacMullen, who taught at Yale for a long time, he was once asked if you would summarize the epic history of the fall of Rome as concisely as possible, what would you say? And he said, well, it took 500 years, but it can be distilled into 3 words, which is fewer had more. I think we're wise to heed that lesson sometimes.
That makes a lot of sense. So I asked you about your favorite essay. Most ostentatious display of wealth that you saw while reporting?
I think it would have to be something that was described to me by the creator, which is that if you're bored on a yacht in the Pacific, one of the things they can do is fly in a 3D printed restaurant and put it onto a sand shelf, and it'll exist for just a few hours before the sand shelf is washed away. And you will get the pleasure of eating in a restaurant that nobody can ever eat in again. How's that?
Yeah, that was big. I thought you were going to talk about them recreating various battles.
That's a good one too, actually. They would recreate the Battle of Midway, and they'd have the smell of the cordite in the air, and the kids would be wearing these vests that give them the sensation of being in a gunfight. And I think what my takeaway from that is that you can take somebody into the most beautiful place in the world on the most extraordinary machine that's ever been created for the high seas. And ultimately, the hedonic thrill of that will wear off. This is the treadmill problem. And so you will get bored. And in a way, you could save yourself a lot of time and money by just learning that lesson and discovering that the insatiability is the problem. It's not the boredom.
I like to think that as I'm on my couch in Brooklyn. I'm like, listen, I'd be bored on a yacht.
Exactly. I think that's very evolved of you. You're think of this fortune you're saving.
So last question, and you talked about this a little bit earlier, but to put a finer point on it, what do you want people to take away from this book?
I hope people will have some fun with the idea that this is a field guide to a world that they may not ever really inhabit. Mm-hmm. And yet at the same time, it comes with a pretty stark warning for us as a culture, as a time, as a country, which is that history is pretty eloquent about what happens to countries in which there is a parting of the paths, in which one group of people gets access to almost literally better biological experience. They have such better health care that they're able to extend their lives. Mm-hmm. They have better education. They have better recreation. And then there's everybody else. When that happens, countries either figure that out, talk honestly about it, look clearly at the data, and then solve the problem by making what are not impossible policy changes, or those countries get into really desperate trouble.
Yeah. Well, it's very... This is a tough place to end the interview in. I'm not going to lie.
But here's the thing. But I'll tell you, here's the part where I find real inspiration from this is that we've actually been down this road before. This is a book ultimately about the new Gilded Age, the one we're living through now. But that's partly because we lived through a Gilded Age. We didn't come apart as a country. And at the end of the 19th century, there were a lot of people who thought this country has gotten too divided by wealth and by political corruption to ever be brought back together again. And actually what happened was that people who cared about the future of the country looked around and said, we have to make changes. We have to figure out ways that more of this income, more of this wealth is making its way into the treasury and not into, boats that are out in the ocean. And as a result, we went on to have an incredibly prosperous and innovative 20th century. And I think that we have that within us. We have that possibility. It just means that we can't pretend that it doesn't exist.
Yeah. Well, Evan, this was great. Thank you for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks, Yas, for having me.